He looked at me quietly across the kitchen table, and in the soft hush of an ordinary evening, he said 3 words that appended everything I thought I knew about myself. What happened next was gentle, complicated, and utterly unexpected, and it left me breathless. Before we begin, tell me, which cities are you watching us from tonight? Drop a name in the comments. I love imagining eyes from different places settling on this little confession. I'm Patricia. I'm 52, and I live in a house that remembers every laugh and every small disaster we've had in the past 28 years. The peeling paint on the back porch is a map of seasons. The kitchen table has a soft groove from where my son used to hammer model airplanes as a kid. My son Daniel is 24 now, working out of state for a while, grown up in the way that makes a mother proud and a little wistful all at once. Michael, the friend who changed the quiet of an evening into something I still turn over in my head, is 26. He has the easy, honest way of people who've been trusted in the rooms of others since they were young adults. He's always been polite, the kind of young man who brings a bottle of wine because it feels like the right thing to do. That night was ordinary in the most domestic sense. The late summer light held on to the kitchen for a long time, painting everything the color of old photographs. I was finishing a pot roast for Sunday dinner. The smell of rosemary and slow-cooked onions filled the air. Michael had come by to pick something Daniel had left behind, a jumbled collection of headphones, a sweatshirt, the keys to a car that wasn't his anymore. He lingered because he'd run into trouble on the phone, because he'd missed a bus, because late summer evenings somehow stretch in such a way that people don't want to step back into the hurry. We sat at the table opposite one another. The radio in the background played a jazz standard my mother used to hum. It felt like all the pasts in the house were watching us with kind, neutral eyes. I made tea. He thanked me in that nice, steady tone. Our conversation began with small things. A mutual gripe about the weather, a comment about how Daniel had grown. Then wandered, as conversations with familiar people do, into stories about college professors, the right way to skin a fish, and the kind of mistakes that teach you more than success ever will. It was the look that came before the words. I can describe it now with all the late-night exactness of memory. It was an unhurried look, not the quick, unsure glance of someone testing a boundary, but the steady, careful gaze of a person who is taking in a portrait and noticing the brush strokes. He watched the line at the corner of my eyes where a laugh or a year had left its mark. He watched the movement of my hands. He paused in his recollection of a story and seemed to weigh each sentence, not rushing, not trying to perform. I felt seen in a way that was strange and complimentary and faintly unnerving because it felt like a kindness I hadn't realized I'd been missing. When Michael finally spoke his confession, it didn't tumble out like a thing needing to be fixed. It came slowly, like a light being turned on, small and precise. "Patricia," he said, and the way he said my name made it feel like an offering and a question at once. "I've always respected what you do for people. I find myself thinking of you in ways I didn't expect." Those words did something inside me that the quiet of the house could not have predicted. For a heartbeat, I was my old self, the woman who had read too many romance novels for comfort, who had imagined what it might feel like to be noticed, to be admired. Then I was also the practical woman who runs a household, who knows the contours of consequence. I listened to him without interrupting, because I wanted his voice to be honest and whole. He explained gently, with no bravado. He talked about how he'd seen me when he was younger, holding a little boy's hand in the grocery store, cheering at a high school recital, and how that image had stayed with him, an example of warmth and steadiness. He admitted that something had shifted as he'd grown up, not as a theft from his friend, but as a separate, complicated feeling that arrived after he had become his own man. He said he'd wrestled with it, that he knew the lines people drew in the world, that he wanted to honor Daniel and to be upfront rather than secretive. He said plainly that he wanted to tell me because not telling felt dishonest. There was no demand in his confession. There was respect threaded through every sentence, awareness of the awkwardness of the situation, and an insistence that he would step back if I asked him to. That insistence, the care with which he offered me the choice, was as intimate as any touch. In the way he spoke, I heard his value system. He treasured consent not as an afterthought, but as the lodestar. My reaction surprised me. I expected a flurry of shame or immediate dismissal. Instead, I felt a slow blooming of curiosity and a quiet tenderness I hadn't known was still possible for me to feel toward another person. The years had given me something like a softer skin. I could recognize longing without being swept by it. I could acknowledge that a young man's admiration might make me feel alive in a new way, while still holding, firmly, the lifelines of what matters: my son, our family, respect. We talked for a long time about boundaries. We talked about age and power, and the way relationships can disguise needs that belong to both people. Michael listened when I spoke about the headaches of being on your own, the small aches of a house when the children leave, the quiet that creeps in after the dishwasher hums its last load. He told me about the loneliness of moving to a city and not knowing anyone's old jokes, about being the only person in a room who answers the phone at 2 a.m. We traded vulnerabilities like people passing a flashlight from hand to hand. There were moments of laughter, the kind that springs up from shared recognition, and moments of silence where the light shifted and the world seemed to hold its breath. In those silences, I noticed details that felt like signposts: the freckle near his left eyebrow, the way his knuckles flexed when he spoke, the earnest tilt of his head when he attempted to explain something and feared he'd said too much. He never reached across the table. He did not try to bridge the gap with a physical move until the moment when I put my cup down and asked him a simple question. "Michael," I said, "what do you want, truly?" He folded his hands in front of him as if to hold them still. "To be clear," he said, "I don't want to complicate Daniel's life or yours. I don't want to be a rebound or a secret. What I want is to see if there's a possibility of something honest. If there isn't, I'll step away. If there is, I want it to be right and careful." That answer, so measured and thoughtful, tugged at something I hadn't acknowledged. I wanted to be seen as more than someone's mother. I wanted to be considered for the woman I was now. The admission did not erase the caution that sat like a stone in my chest, but it let a small door open, the one where 2 adults might stand, look at each other, and decide deliberately about a path forward. We agreed to slow things down. We set rules out loud. No secrets from Daniel. No meetings that could be misunderstood. Time to think through feelings before acting on them. We both realized that if this was to be more than a passing infatuation, it would have to survive scrutiny and doubt. We decided to meet again in the same ordinary place, my kitchen, that evening of light, with honest conversation as our scaffolding. Then came the moment that will always live in the small chest of memory. Michael reached across the table, not to touch me in a way that erased the rules, but to close the distance briefly between our hands. His fingers brushed mine for the span of a breath, and in that single, careful touch, I felt the weight of what had been said settle into something softer. It wasn't a promise, and it wasn't an escalation. It was acknowledgement. He looked at me quietly, and when he spoke his voice was a little softer than before. "If you're open to exploring this, slowly, respectfully, I'd be honored." I felt my pulse quicken, not with panic, but with the fierce, curious pulse of a woman who has been given permission to be surprised by life again. Breathless. Yes, in the literal sense, but also in a way that felt like the house holding its breath with me. The rest of the night folded around that soft, suspended feeling. When he left, he hugged me. A brief, polite hug that was not secretive and not grabby, just human, and thanked me for listening. I did not sleep easily that night. I turned over the rules, and the possible consequences, and the small joys that might come from a life that had room for a new kind of companionship. I thought about respect, the kind that requires us to be brave enough to speak honestly and brave enough to say no when needed. Above all, I felt grateful for the way Michael had handled himself, candid, considerate, and mindful of the ties that mattered. "I'll stop here for tonight, because I want to hear first from you. Which cities did you tell me you were watching from? And when you're ready, I'll tell you how that quiet look and that brave confession led us to a choice neither of us had expected, and what it taught me about longing, restraint, and the quiet courage it takes to love someone responsibly." The morning after Michael's visit, the kitchen felt different. It wasn't the room that had changed, it was the way I looked at it. The table, the chairs, even the fading sunlight that fell across the counter seemed to hold a secret. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat where he had sat the night before, tracing the faint marks on the wood, remembering how his voice had carried both restraint and desire. I tried to push the memory aside. I told myself it was just words, that perhaps the weight I gave them was heavier than he intended. But the truth sat stubbornly inside me. His confession had opened a door in my heart that I thought was long since locked. For 2 days, I avoided the idea of reaching out. I busied myself with chores, with calls to Daniel, with errands that took me into town. But everything reminded me of Michael. At the grocery store, I passed the tea he liked and thought of his careful gratitude. In the garden, I noticed how late summer roses bloomed defiantly against the fading heat, and I thought of his words. Slow, respectful, hopeful. On the 3rd evening, the quiet grew too thick. I found myself dialing his number, not because I had rehearsed what to say, but because silence felt dishonest after such honesty from him. He answered quickly, his voice steady but touched with surprise. "Patricia?" "Yes," I thought. "Maybe we should talk again." There was no hesitation. "I'd like that. Whenever you're ready." And so, a week later, he came back. This time, I lit a lamp in the living room instead of keeping us in the kitchen. The softer glow felt less like an interrogation, more like a conversation waiting to unfold. He arrived with a small bouquet, nothing extravagant, just wildflowers picked up from the stand by the highway. The gesture was simple, and it made me smile despite the nerves twisting inside me. We sat opposite each other again, only now the air between us carried the memory of his confession. For a while, we filled the space with easy topics: the het wave, a new cafe in town, Daniel's latest work updates. But I could feel his eyes watching me with quiet patience, waiting for me to steer us toward the thing that really mattered. "Michael," I said finally, my fingers smoothing the hem of my dress, "I've been thinking about what you told me." He nodded, not rushing me. His restraint gave me courage. I won't pretend it didn't surprise me. I continued, "It did, and it made me question things I thought were settled long ago. But what struck me most wasn't just what you said. It was how you said it. You didn't push, you didn't hide, and you didn't expect. You gave me room." His voice, when it came, was low and certain. "Because you deserve that. Whatever you decide, Patricia, it has to be your choice, not the weight of my feelings on your shoulders." I studied him then, the young man who had been part of my son's world for years, who had grown into someone thoughtful enough to handle something this delicate with dignity. There was a steadiness in him that belied his age, and I realized that the difference in years mattered less than I thought. What mattered was the way he saw me, not as someone fading into the background of her own life, but as a woman still worthy of attention and care. The conversation deepened. We spoke of loneliness, his, mine. I admitted how the house sometimes felt too big now that Daniel was gone, how the silence pressed in after sunset. He confessed how, in crowded rooms, he often felt invisible, his stories overshadowed by louder voices. There was an odd comfort in the symmetry of our confessions. Two people, different in age but alike in the quiet spaces they carried. At one point, the silence between us stretched long. I looked at him, really looked at him, and found that my chest tightened with something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years: anticipation. I asked him a question that had lingered in my mind all week. What do you see in me, Michael? Really? He leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. I see someone who gives without asking for much in return. Someone who listens, who remembers small